Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Bobby Gilstrap, and we're glad to have joining us today Dr. Chuck Kelley. Dr. Chuck Kelley is a person that many of you already know and have known for some time. Dr. Chuck, we are glad to have you with us today.
It is my honor and privilege, my friend.
Well, it's good to have you. Just a real quick, in the way of introduction, real fast. Many of you, if you don't know, Dr. Kelley is the semi-retired. He's no longer the active president at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He is the president emeritus at this point. He and I were talking before we went live, and he said, well, I just stopped doing all the meetings. Now I get to do the fun stuff, which is what we all ought to do, not really retiring. But he is the distinguished research professor of evangelism and has been an author for a long time, writes a regular blog now, those kind of things. So we are delighted to have him joining us today. And we're not going to kill a lot of time here. We're going to jump right into the conversation and ask him to respond some. He has written this book called The Best Intentions. And so we want to dialogue about that. It is basically a book that's going back and looking at all of the things that we can statistically look and see some of those metrics that you could look at related to what's happened since the Great Commission Resurgence was passed back in 2010. So, Dr. Kelley, why don't you give us just a few words of introduction, kind of a background for why you wrote the book and all, and then I want to get into some specifics that really come from the book and let you be able to unpack some of that for us.
Well, Southern Baptists have a habit of passing major initiatives from time to time and rarely going back to see what happened after those initiatives were approved. The Great Commission Resurgence was an initiative that focused on revitalizing, re-engaging the convention with the Great Commission in evangelism and reaching the nation and world for Christ. That's my personal area of interest and passion, so I was very interested in what would happen afterwards. I also was the only entity head who did not endorse the Great Commission Resurgence because I had concerns that it was not actually about evangelism and mobilizing our people to reach the lost. It was about some other things. So I was very curious, but I had to wait 10 years for the data to accumulate, to have plenty of time to evaluate with a lot of integrity what actually has happened since those proposals were approved.
Yeah, there's been a lot of things that have happened. I had a friend say to me not too long ago that he said, if I had a ball team and we started looking at the statistics of our win-loss record and all of that kind of thing, he said, it wouldn't take me 10 years to make a correction. He said, I'd have made a correction much sooner after 3 to 5 years data. But, 10 years data, there's no question you can see some distinct trend lines in what has been happening, and we really need to take some correction. So let's jump right into it. To start with, let's just ask initially, did a Great Commission Resurgence actually take place, Dr. Kelley?
Not by any standard of measure. And actually, it'd be more accurate to say it was a Great Commission regression. We have fewer missionaries overseas, fewer missionaries in America. We have significantly lower evangelism. We've lost more than 2 million members. We have more than 2 million people not attending church in Baptist churches anymore. CP is not at all what it was projected to be. Virtually every category we care about has been down in the last 10 years, not up, especially anything related to evangelism.
What did you find as the top 3 most troubling findings as you were doing this research?
Well, I was very troubled, first of all, that the huge amount of attention given to church planting has not produced any outcome that was expected. That we started about 1,003 churches in 2011, and in 2021 we started 600 churches, and the number of churches started went steadily downward. And that's in light of being told by NAMB that we needed to start 1,500 churches a year to keep up with the population growth. We did have one Baptist church for every 6,000 people. Now, one Baptist church for every 7,000 people, approximately. So that's very concerning. Second great concern is our evangelism. And we have just had tremendous struggles in our evangelism. Our evangelism, baptisms per church, was about 7%, 7.2% in 2010, 2011. Now it's 3.2%. That's about a 50% reduction in baptisms per church. And so and that's just one way of looking at it. Any way you want to measure it, our baptisms are way, way down. Only 1 year in the last 10 had a higher number of baptisms than we had during the Great Depression. This is not good. The third thing that concerned me was the cooperative program. That in the summer 2021 edition of SBC Life Journal, they did a chart that showed the number of churches supporting CP and not supporting CP. 13,000 Southern Baptist churches did not support CP in 2010. In 2021, 19,000 churches, in 2019, 19,000 churches did not support CP. That's almost 40% of our churches were not giving to the cooperative program. That's very concerning. So these are three areas that I find very critical and indicate the Southern Baptist Convention, the mighty SBC, is thoroughly in the grip of decline.
Well, it sure is. And it's pretty obvious when you look at it like that and you start laying out these statistics. I would encourage folks to go ahead and look at getting this book if they have not gotten your book yet. We are going to run at the bottom. If you'll notice, I'm scrolling right now, the book and the website where they can go order that. Not just to be a commercial, but the reality is we're going to talk about some of this, and in an hour you can't really unpack it all, but you have really done a good job just taking just the basic information that's available through our annual church profile, interviews, other things that you have done, and you have laid it out on basically in charts and graphs where you can look at that in addition to some of your analysis of what's happened. So I think it is very valuable for folks to be able to take it and look at it real fast. Did a Great Commission Resurgence actually take place then at all?
No.
If you see that, what
No.
were the key factors that contributed to this historic decline you've just mentioned?
Well, just a few questions. It's always more complicated than it seems. And so there
Right.
are many different things involved, but just to look at some of the most important, of course, our culture has changed. We are a much more pluralistic nation now than we have been in the past, and that is obviously a factor. But things that we don't have any kind of control on that is what it is, and we simply have to deal with it in the best way that we can. But of great concern to me is largely turning away from evangelism. And it's okay and matter of fact, necessary to do church planting. Every year, the North American Mission Board and Home Mission Board, before it, budgets had more money spent on church planting than spent on evangelism. But we didn't just emphasize church planting, we de-emphasized evangelism. Stopped talking about it, took apart the network for evangelism that had existed in Southern Baptist life for decades, and just basically went pretty much silent on evangelism. And that is a very big problem. Evangelism is one of those things that when you stop emphasizing it, you stop doing it. It requires attention. And we lost the focus on reaching our neighbors for Christ. And that's kind of a second thing that happened. We have had more focus on the Great Commission elsewhere in other nations of the world, in other parts of the United States, elsewhere, and not on our neighbors and the children of our friends and the people in the community. And that is very, very concerning, and it really had a profound effect. A second great effect is that NAMB undid what had been the heartbeat of Southern Baptist cooperation. For the first 50, 75 years of the convention, no one really knew what to do with the Home Mission Board, now NAMB. It's a very different scenario than the International Mission Board, which goes into places where there are not churches. There's no Christian presence or ministry. The Home Mission Board, however, is here in the United States, and we've got thousands of churches everywhere, and they're working on the Great Commission. And so you have state conventions, you have associations, you have the national entity all working on the same task, and they were not communicating very well. There was reduplication of effort, there was confusion, there was miscommunication. But then in about the mid 20th century, the Home Mission Board then started working went to each state convention and developed a cooperative agreement on who's going to do what and who's going to pay for what on starting churches, doing evangelism, etc. That launched the explosive growth of the SBC. You can see it in the data when that coordination between the Home Mission Board and the state conventions, associations, and local churches got in sync. Southern Baptist blew out of the South and into all 50 states. The Great Commission Resurgence told NAMB to eliminate all those agreements, and they did. And as a result, it had a deep effect on the cooperative fabric of the SBC. So bad that the conventions outside of the South were devastated economically as NAMB pulled money that had been supporting their efforts in evangelism and church planting and other things. And for the first time in the history of the SBC, a group of state executives wrote a letter to the executive committee complaining that they had been abandoned by the North American Mission Board and devastated by their actions, and were contemplating pulling out of the cooperative program. That's a nuclear explosion for the Southern Baptist fabric of cooperation, and it had a very detrimental effect, especially in the most unreached parts of the nation. Very significant. And I think a third thing that happened was the cooperative program just continued losing steam. And as I shared earlier, more and more churches were stopping their giving. The Southern Baptist Convention agenda changed, and we started talking about things other than the Great Commission in great chunks of time at the national level. And it turned people away from a Great Commission focus. Now, that's the glue that has kept the Southern Baptist Convention together. And when the Great Commission is no longer priority one in the Southern Baptist conversation, Southern Baptists tend to stop talking and begin pulling back, because everything we do is based on voluntary cooperation, not assignment. And when you lose that voluntary cooperation, you've got trouble. So those are a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, and we could unpack most everything you said there for hours and hours, and you do unpack some of it in the book for sure. But the issue of cooperation obviously is a huge deal. I know when I was serving as the executive director in Michigan, one of the other executive directors said to me when all this started coming down in 2011, he said to me, "We have just traded cooperation for competition." Because the North American Mission Board set so many things up where the state conventions were starting to compete with each other about who could get funding for this, for that. They defunded all of the jointly funded associational missionaries that were all across the non-South areas, defunded anything that was a missionary assignment across the United States that did not fit within just church planting. So I want us to address that here a little bit more in a moment, but you brought up the issue of cultural shifts, and David Cranford has written and asked in the comments, he says, because of the cultural shifts in our nation away from Christianity, wouldn't the Great Commission regression have happened anyway? How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say it's doubtful, because Southern Baptists were gearing up for a massive emphasis on evangelism. It was the largest coordinated emphasis on evangelism in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention. It was called God's Plan for Sharing. It was going to go over the course of a decade. It was going to involve all state conventions had already signed on, many associations, the entities, everybody had budgeted for it, everybody had it on their calendars, and it involved evangelism in many different dimensions. Yes, personal evangelism and sharing the gospel, Bible distribution, media spots on television and radio, and many different things, multi-layered in and strategies based on each region of the country, resources that had been field tested and proven to be effective as churches tried them out before it was launched. That was scheduled to launch in 2010, which was the same year the Great Commission Resurgence was approved. NAMB quickly put that on the back burner. They dismantled the team that put it together. They dismantled much of the strategy. Things they'd already paid for, they kept doing, but they just completely took apart the strategy. What would have happened if we had passed the Great Commission Resurgence proposals and laid it on top of this massive, every state convention, most associations involved in specific evangelistic activities in the communities of the United States? What would have happened? We'll never know. So is evangelism a challenge today? Yes. I just had a hospital stay for several days, had to postpone this interview as a result of that. And I had a chance to witness, I think, every one of the nurses that I had in the days I was in, I had a chance to share the faith with in some way. And some of them were Christians and some of them were not. Had some very interesting conversations. But that's the nature of the beast. Would it have been a Great Commission regression anyway? I don't know. I doubt it. It may not have been as impactful as we wanted it to be, but to not do evangelism is always less productive than doing evangelism.
Yeah, I've always heard the old adage, you evangelize and then congregationalize. Just kind of an easy way of remembering that evangelism is what actually takes place. Churches are formed by people who have been evangelized, and the natural progression that we actually see it in the New Testament, and we've seen it, just throughout a variety of countries around the world, is when groups of people are being evangelized, the natural thing is to come together for fellowship. The natural thing is to come together for learning and being discipled, et cetera, et cetera. And God's plan for sharing was a really well-designed national strategy. I remember a lot of legwork was being put into that. A lot of time was being put into that. And in just talking to the various executive directors at the time, there was a lot of work being done behind the scenes. And all of a sudden, when that was eliminated, not only did the staff who were at the North American Mission Board get eliminated, but all of those connections, all of that support system just disappeared. There was just no more resourcing for evangelism virtually at all. In fact, if I remember right, and I can't remember if you mentioned this in the book or not, but North American Mission Board at the time had somewhere around 50 or more evangelism specialists in the North American Mission Board, travel across the country to churches, associations, state conventions, helping train in everything from interfaith evangelism, special event evangelism, all kinds of different ways of reaching people. I remember the first block parties I ever learned to do was in a partnership with the state of Oklahoma, the Baptist Convention of Oklahoma, and North American Mission Board, and they went across our state in various places, just training how do you do special events. Had a huge impact on our ministry long term, without any doubt. Let me ask you this. What do you find, or what did you find as evidences of the great shift to centralized control?
Well, one was the elimination of those cooperative agreements. When you had a a real strategic partnership between NAMB and each of the state conventions. It wasn't one agreement that all the state conventions signed on. It was an individually negotiated arrangement between NAMB and each state convention. So you had a decentralized strategic partnership that identified these are things our state convention really wants to do. These are things the North American Mission Board really wants to do. Now, how can we accomplish as much of those two agendas as possible and put them together into one common approach to this part of the country? And you went from, and that was gone. That just was gone.
Right.
So NAMB began creating its own program for church planting. So if you're going to do church planting, you have to do it in the NAMB process, not the way we want to do it in California or the way we need to do it in New England or Texas or whatever. Is one process. The other indication was NAMB started with great fanfare announcing that they were going to have regional vice presidents in each major region of the country who would be the liaison between NAMB and the regions of that country. Those were gone before they filled all the positions. And it never did pan out.
I was going to say, let me help clarify just a little bit what you said. You had to go through the NAMB process to be able to plant. Just to be clear, if you were to receive any money that had been given by our churches through the cooperative program that had been given to North American Mission Board to help resource church planting, that was the catch. They were going to hold the money unless you went through their process. So in other words, churches, associations, state conventions could still have a part in resourcing church planting in their given state without any help from North American Mission Board. And that has always gone on. There's always been churches that have gathered in small groups and small networks or associations and helped plant a church.
We're
and
Baptist.
So and so. They've done that. But all these resources had been available through the North American Mission Board. And it's not that there don't need to be some standards. There do need to be some standards. But this shift that you talk about is a great shift. Centralize the power in such a way that what was being done locally, contextually, was no longer adequate. It had to be this, I've called it kind of a cookie cutter approach, but they wanted to have total control over that. So a local state convention couldn't do assessments, couldn't do training, couldn't do those kind of things the way they want to do it to meet their context of where they are. It had to go through the NAMB system.
Well, and probably the best evidence is that letter I referenced earlier from a group of state convention execs complaining that NAMB had abandoned them, and the response of the North American Mission Board to that letter, and I have both of the letters in the appendix of my book. The response of NAMB was probably the worst response by an entity to a concern that's ever been in a letter in the history of the SBC.
Agreed.
The trustees of NAMB responded and said, "That's exactly right. We intend to control everything." And this was quite intentional, and they wanted to be in charge. And I think what must have been in the background, may or may not, I don't know. It's like they wanted to take the approach of the International Mission Board and use it in the United States. But these are vastly different situations. International Mission Board is the only player, the only Baptist player in a nation when it goes into an unchurched nation. But NAMB is here surrounded. I mean, we got nearly 50,000 churches, and they're in all 50 states. We have state conventions, we have associations. And so acting totally independently is not an option for NAMB as it is for the International Mission Board. And so that's why very quickly after GCR, there was language about we want to decentralize the North American Mission Board, but it was the opposite. In fact, the strategy was to centralize control, to eliminate the decentralized strategic planning that was going on and making NAMB and state conventions kind of equal or similar partners. Now, here's the thing about autonomous units. NAMB is completely autonomous. State convention is completely autonomous. Anybody in a partnership will tell you there's always friction when you have autonomous entities dealing together. If it's two guys who own a business together, they will eventually have some different ideas about what's most important, or do we expand here, or do we do this, or do we do that? There's always friction to some level in partnerships, but they knew they had to work it out, and they did. And so it's very interesting. And Ed Stetzer documented this in a paper that he did for the Great Commission Resurgence Task Force that has not been released. They boxed up and put away all of their papers for 15 years. That's unprecedented in Baptist life. They don't want anybody to see.
I want to come back and talk
they,
about. I want to come back and talk about the transparency issue in just a second. But let me stop you. I want to ask you this question. Robin Foster has a comment that I want to add as a follow-up to this question particularly. I just want your personal opinion on this. Was the GCR a good missional strategy?
No, I don't think so. The reason I did not endorse the Great Commission Resurgence is that it was about denominational infrastructure. It was about CP funding and distribution. And it was about church planting. What's missing from that? The local congregations of the SBC being mobilized to share Christ with the lost in their communities. That simply was not there. And when I was approached and asked to endorse it, and I said no, they were very surprised. You know, Dr. Kelley, you've always been passionate about evangelism. Why won't you endorse this? I said, it's not about evangelism. It's about denominational infrastructure. It's about funding. And it's about one methodology of church planting. It's not about reaching the lost people in our communities. And I said, this train of decline is coming. I've been tracking Southern Baptist evangelism my whole adult life. And I have seen this decline coming. I have written about it. I have preached about it in nearly every state convention. I've been banging this drum for a long time. And I said, when they asked me to endorse it, I said, this will do nothing to slow down or stop decline from taking root in the SBC. And eventually that decline is going to become so obvious, there will be no place to hide. And that's where we are now. We are in the grip of decline. So I don't think it was a good missional strategy because it left out the local church and its responsibility to reach the lost in its community. Were there good aspects of it? Sure, always, yes. But I could not endorse it as a missional strategy because it was incomplete.
Yeah, Robin asked this question kind of as a follow-up to that. In other words, was the GCR mission-driven or theological-driven? I think this is a great question. How would you unpack that?
I think it was mission-driven. It wasn't theologically driven. I don't think anybody on the task force had a theological agenda. And we have to remember, these were great people who loved Jesus, who were deeply involved in ministry, and who were trying to do their best. I don't think anybody had a theological agenda that they were trying to sneak in through this door. I think it was mission-driven. I just think they missed the mainstream of what it takes to generate a Great Commission resurgence. And that is local churches mobilized, motivated, equipped, and sent out to their communities to share the gospel. That just was not there. And as a result, infrastructure things happened, giving things happened, and church planting happened, but not evangelism, not an increase in reaching the lost of our nation or our world. And as a result of that, everything else started going down. So pick a category. Do you want to talk money? Do you want to talk missionaries on overseas, missionaries here in North America? I mean, it's to a point. The North American Mission Board doesn't even want us to know how many missionaries it has assigned to church planting. That's
Right.
I can't conceive
That's
that.
astounding.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just astounding. And so it was a missional strategy. It was intended to be a missional strategy. I would simply say it was an incomplete missional strategy. And that's what did it in terms of making a Great Commission impact.
Okay, so let me ask you this: Do you think, along the lines of Robin's question about theological, there has been an increase, a rise over the last, 15, 20 years for sure, in Reformed theology. And
Mhm.
some of the guys that I know of that are kind of strong into the Reformed theology are very, I won't say anti-evangelism, but they just don't put that at the forefront. And just kind of the way they play it out. And I had a guy here maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago now, who responded to me talking about how he had purified his congregation. And when he got there, there were 225 average attendance. And he said, now we have a faithful 30, kind of thing. And that was kind of, something he was proud of. Do you think any of that kind of mindset has played into some of the things that have happened structurally, some of the things that we have seen happen that were, I know the name Great Commission Resurgence. Who's going to vote against Great Commission, right? But that's not really what happened. And it doesn't appear that even in the systems and structures that were implemented soon after that happened. Do you think there's any impact from the shift in some of the Reformed theology maybe is kind of getting a better hold?
Yeah, I think that there has very definitely been an impact on Southern Baptist evangelism from the rise of Reformed theology in the Southern Baptist Convention. That was not the subject of this research. And again, I want to say the Great Commission Resurgence Task Force, as well as I can tell, did not have a theological agenda. But as we notice, the culture around us is less Christian, more pluralistic. That was a factor that affected the things that happened. And Reformed theology in Southern Baptist life, I think, has had a definite effect on Southern Baptist evangelism. Just for instance, and it is a lack of a sense of urgency about evangelism.
Hmm.
And, if we would have had the last 10 years of statistics 30 years ago, it would have been all anybody wanted to talk about. It would have been a subject of conversation. People would have said, okay, what are we going to do? How can we turn this around? I've been beating this drum for more than a decade. I did a presentation in 2010 called Southern Baptists Are Becoming the New Methodists that dealt with all of this and the problems that were coming and the loss of discipleship in Baptist life that was affecting our evangelism. And I had a lot of people see that presentation and respond to it. But has it become a convention conversation? No, no. And this has not been the dominant conversation at any SBC. And that is the big concern. And it is not a big concern of NAMB. It is not the subject of the NAMB report every year. It is not the subject of a whole lot of motions at the SBC or resolutions. People, the passion and sense of urgency that Southern Baptists have had for much of our history is greatly diminished. Why? I don't think you can say it is entirely the result of Reformed theology, but I don't think you can say Reformed theology has had no effect on that. I know the experiences I've had with students, and I know our seminary required every student who walked across the stage to spend a semester going out in the city of New Orleans, door to door, sharing Christ. And I have been encouraged to go to my great heavenly reward because of that program. I have had students get extremely angry with me. I have had all kinds of pushback from that. And it was primarily from more reformed students. And the conversation is very simple. The most evangelistic people I know are reformed. How many times have I heard that? But the reality, now that is a study I think that needs to be done. I'm not a theologian. Somebody else needs to do that study. But it would be a very fascinating study indeed, because I think the evidence is there. The rise of Reformed theology and the decline of evangelism have happened at the same time. Is there a correlation? I can't say definitively, but I can say suggestively. I think there's some kind of connection.
Now, another thing you said that was of impact, you mentioned giving, and I think that's a significant thing. What did you find was the impact of approving the Great Commission giving option? Prior to the Great Commission Resurgence, it was cooperative program and solely cooperative program.
The biggest problem with Great Commission giving was the distraction from the conversation we needed to have about reaching the lost in our community. As soon as they put that out there, that immediately became the focal point of discussion. It was the first time in Southern Baptist history when a task force was recommending giving attention, recognition, affirmation, and praise for designated giving and not just cooperative program giving. Southern Baptists have always had designated giving. It's not a new invention. We just never talked about it, praised it, affirmed it, held it up as a model for people to follow because we promoted the cooperative program. When they introduced that concept, virtually all the pre-convention chatter on social media, Baptist state papers, columns written was about Great Commission giving as a competitor to the cooperative program and damage done to the cooperative program. Virtually all the conversation in the convention discussion itself, it lasted an hour, which is huge by SBC standards. Virtually all of it, but maybe 2 minutes, was about Great Commission giving, not about the urgent need to reach the lost in our communities. And in the aftermath, virtually all the discussion was about Great Commission giving for 10, 12 months, and then gone. It's invisible. I don't think it damaged the cooperative program significantly. I think its greatest damage was in distracting Southern Baptists from the conversation they needed to have. And brother, it did that in spades.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you. Do you feel like that was probably an intentional effort? I know, and I hate to talk about denominational politics, but that's exactly what's gone on with all of this. In the world of secular politics, oftentimes you name something or you do something in hopes of distracting enough that you're able to do something else kind of behind the scenes and pull that off. Do you think the Great Commission giving was just a kind of a ploy to be able to distract attention from some of these
Absolutely
other significant things?
No, absolutely not. I don't think that at all. Remember, every member of the Great Commission Task Force, outstanding Christian, loved Jesus, theologically sound, genuinely wanted to start a Great Commission Resurgence. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I think this did have an agenda, however. I think it does reflect that through the years of the conservative resurgence, many of the men who were elected president of the SBC came from churches that were not strong supporters of the cooperative program. And they were not giving anything like 10% has kind of been the golden standard for CP support in Southern Baptist life for decades and decades. And many of the guys elected president during the conservative resurgence to pull our convention back to its biblical foundations were more like 1% or 2%. And although they were much beloved and they were elected as presidents and they did what they had to do to get us moving back to our biblical foundations, they were still in that process criticized for not giving more to CP. And many of those guys would say, but my church gave $500,000 to the cooperative program. That's a lot. Don't talk about percentage, talk about dollars. And there was this frustration at not being appreciated for the dollar amount given to CP because they weren't giving a percentage amount that many people thought they should give. I
Right.
think this was a response to that. It was not trying to distract from the Great Commission. It was not
Okay.
trying to keep people from thinking about evangelism.
So,
It
so
was
you think it was
simply
built
trying to
more on?
bring recognition.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Do you think that that ended up being more of a pride issue that we want to be able to
Yes.
recognize it? Because I know last church I pastored before getting into church planting and serving for the North American Mission Board for a decade in Michigan. The church I was pastoring gave 32.5% to the cooperative program, another 7.25% to the local association. So basically 40% out of every dollar went to mission causes right off the bat.
Yeah.
But the total numbers, I mean, the church averaged 230, 235, 240, in Sunday school on a given Sunday. So the numbers, as far as just dollars and cents, was nothing comparable to a First Baptist Woodstock, a First Baptist whatever, these huge churches. But our people always felt like, look, it ought to be equal sacrifice, not equal numbers, just everybody giving equally as far as a percentage basis. And when your gifts are up, it goes up for everybody, missions included. When it goes down, it goes the other way. And so you feel like maybe it was more the pride issue of just being able to recognize some of the larger church pastors who weren't giving but 0.75% or 1 or 2%.
I'm going to let you and your viewers in on a secret.
Okay.
This is the least known, least considered, most ignored influential factor on modern Southern Baptist life today. And that is the issue of self-esteem. Southern Baptists have a serious self-esteem problem. We simply don't feel good about who we are as Southern Baptists. And you see this in a lot of ways. That wanting the recognition for the dollar giving rather than percentage giving, that's a self-esteem thing. I want people to appreciate we have done something significant. Those are dollars being spent on missions because we gave them. But I'm not getting the recognition that your little church, for giving that huge percentage, gets. It's a self-esteem problem. I want to be appreciated. Why do churches take Baptist out of their name? We have this happening in record numbers. It's having a profound effect on the convention. It's one of the issues we're dealing with. Because as far as the world, when a church doesn't want the community to know it's a Baptist church, you've got an issue. When 2 presidents of the SBC had to send out an announcement to their people before they were nominated, saying, now, you may not know we're Southern Baptist, but I'm about to be nominated to be president of the Southern Baptist Convention. We actually are a Southern Baptist church, because a number of people in their church didn't know that. Well, why? Do you know there have been all kinds of scandals associated with the Catholic Church in America in recent years? There have been all kinds of scandals associated with the Methodist Church in recent years. There have been all kinds of scandals with many groups. They don't change their name. Southern Baptists want to drop Baptist, and it's not even Southern Baptist in the name. It's Baptist. And when we don't feel good about who we are, when we don't want our people to have this identified sense of being Baptist, it diminishes our presence in the community. So if you drive around today, you'll see a lot of churches that may be Baptist, but you have no idea because it's not on their sign. There's no indication that they are a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it looks like the Southern Baptist Convention is smaller than it once was. And self-esteem. So do not associate a theological agenda with the Great Commission Resurgence. I don't think there was one. Do not think that Great Commission giving was introduced as a ploy to distract attention from evangelism or reaching the lost. No, not by any means. There was a deep commitment to want to see this world come to Christ. But another issue took place. That other issue, and I've lost your audio, Bobby, but that other issue was self-esteem,
Oh,
and it really has become a big issue in Southern Baptist life.
yeah, no question. So what you're saying basically is you don't think it was intentional to distract,
No,
but the reality
no,
was that's what happened. That was
no.
maybe an unanticipated, result because of that. You mentioned this
And,
earlier from some of your research, and I think this is pretty important. Let's unpack real quickly as well. How did the lack of transparency impact every stage of the GCR process? Not just since, there's been a lot of discussion since, but even in the beginning. Unpack that a little bit for us.
well, I don't think there was a problem with transparency for the task force. The task force rarely does continual updates on what they're doing or what they're talking about. That's the nature of the beast.
Right.
I think where the transparency set in has been in the aftermath in Southern Baptists not being given a sense of the progress or lack thereof that's actually taken place. In the process of my research, I interacted with people at most SBC entities, and in nearly every case, they were very transparent. They were very helpful. They answered my questions as quickly and clearly as they could. But there was one entity that was not transparent at all, and that entity has developed a reputation, I think, of people who interact with it that they're just not transparent, and you're not going to learn everything you want to know. You're not going to get the basic information that you'd like to have. And so that's pretty focused in one entity. It's not focused in the whole SBC, in all entities in general. And I don't know what's behind it. I don't think there's anything nefarious behind it. Some people just like to play close to the vest. But the reality is that Southern Baptist culture of presenting data in a positive light for a moment in time, this year compared to last year, this month compared to last year. That's the way we've always presented data. It's very tedious to put the 1 year reports together into a 10-year report. Man, did I spend hours doing that. But that's what gives you the trend line, not only on where we are, seeing 2 months at a time or a year, 2 years at a time, that tells you where you are. Doesn't tell you anything about where you're going.
Well,
Where
now,
we've
and
lacked
you were very,
transparency, I was going to say,
I was
where
just
we've
going to
lacked
say,
transparency is we have not communicated to the convention the trend line of where the SBC is. And that's pretty much across the board in the convention. I think that would be helpful and healthy for the convention if that became a part of our data sharing culture.
right now, you do identify in the book that entity you're referring to is North American Mission Board, and that is something that we have seen a lot of issues with. In fact, there are some things that they have refused to report that historically have been reported before. Address that just a little bit, because you do bring that out in the book.
Well, for instance, they do not report how many missionaries they've assigned to church planting. I think it's the only mission board on the surface of the earth that doesn't want its donors and supporters to know how many missionaries they have working on their primary assignment that they're very public about. That's just odd. It's very strange. We get data about the survival rate of our church plants at the end of 4 years, and it's 80%. That's wonderful. I'm thrilled about that. That's great.
Right.
What
Yeah.
we don't get is beyond 4 years. Most of the subsidy that happens in church planting happens for 4 years. Now, once you hit that fifth year, you're beginning to get out of subsidy. And I was able to get one piece of information about one class of church planters 5 years after they started their church. And that survival rate between year 4 and year 5 went from 80% to 60%. And the cooperative program participation rate went to 25%. after 5 years were given the cooperative program. Now, that's very important data, but we are not given information on how our church plants are doing over time. And again, I think a decade is a very important figure. 5 years is the next best thing. 4 years is nice, but again, especially if that's characterized by subsidy, that's an artificial thing. How is that church doing? Because we may, if we look at all that, we may determine if we're going to plant churches, maybe we need a 7-year subsidy or an 8-year subsidy. But we're not given any of that data, that information beyond year 4. And when you see a projection in 30 years, most of our churches will be church plants. Well, we're never told how that comes to be. What is the projection? What are the assumptions that lead you to say that? Does that take into account the drop in survivability for the church plants we've been starting in the last decade, the drop in cooperative program participation? Because if we have a steadily decreasing survivability rate beyond year 5, and their CP giving rate drops dramatically beyond year 5, well, that Southern Baptist Convention, composed mostly of those new churches that we started, that's not going to be a very healthy Southern Baptist Convention. So there's just, there's a lot of data that it would be good to be able to have that would help us understand things and see what's going on that we're not getting right now.
Yeah, in one of your tweets this morning, the response from Reform NAMB Now, I thought this was interesting. I wanted to get you to speak to it real quickly. They responded to one of your tweets this morning related to North American Mission Board and its funding. And it simply says, all for funding plants if the money is reaching them, meaning the church plants. As for the inflation from 2010 to 2022, it's up 37.6%. NAMB's planting budget, not the amount the plants receive, is up almost 300%. That's pretty incredible. Another person calculated that roughly $121,000 per church, 80% of the plants will receive $70,000 or less over that 4-year period you just addressed. Speak to that for us.
Well, you have to realize the limitations of what we know. And we simply are not given much information. To take the total amount of the church planting budget and divide it by the number of new church starts, you'll get a number, but that's not necessarily an accurate number.
Yeah,
there are
absolutely.
other costs that they may be using that for. And that's the problem. We're just not told. We don't know what's our average amount we're spending per church planter in an urban area, in a small town, a rural area. We simply do not know what they're spending. What we do know is that the budget went from about 25,000 to 25 million to 73 million in 10 years, and we have 100 fewer church planters. We're employing fewer church planters after a 300% budget increase. We do know we were starting 1,003 churches in 2011, and in 2021 we started 600 churches, and now we're starting to include replants in that church planting number. That's a church that existed that had a SBC ID number at facilities, and counting that as a new church, that's a different thing than starting a church from scratch, in my opinion. But we just don't know. So unless NAMB gives us the information on how they're spending that money, all we know with certainty is they have a dramatic amount more money in their church planting budget. They have hired fewer church planters. They have started fewer church plants. And that's all we know, because that's all the information that's available. And there may be many things beyond that that would help us understand why they increase the budget that much, but don't have as many people and don't have as many church plants. But again, that's just their purview. It's what information they want to reveal to the convention.
Yeah, it's been quite interesting to kind of follow that and see how that has changed. I know for a long time they were using the STAR technology, STAR terminology, meaning we're looking for 5-star church planners. And I kind of was a little uncomfortable with that to some extent, especially when some of the assessment was going on the way it was, because I knew that someone who's planting in a very rural area is going to look differently than someone who's planting in, a downtown urban area like 5 Points here in Atlanta, or even a suburban area. Those are different. Now, there's some core competencies they need to have, obviously, but they are going to be very different in the way they relate and the way they plant to be effective. You put the wrong guy, you put an urban guy out there in the rural area, he's going to blow up. It's not going to be effective at all. So,
well, and the thing that is unsettled, Bobby, that is a really big deal. It raises the question of the viability of church planting as a methodology for evangelism. We were told back in 2011, 2012, NAMB told us that in order to keep up with the growth of the population and the number of churches who close their doors or leave the convention, we need to start 15,000 new churches in 10 years, 1,500 churches new every year. We have never approached that in the last decade, not even close. And now we're 50% below what we were doing in 2011, almost 50% below. Can we keep up with the population with this strategy? I mean, we were lamenting that we had only one Southern Baptist church for approximately every 6,000 or so of the population back in 2011, 2012. Last year, it was one Southern Baptist church for every 7,000 or more a population unit. That means we're losing ground, that our churches are not keeping up with the growth of the population. Okay, so what's plan B? If this present strategy is not allowing us to keep up, we got 10 years with this. We got 10 years of highly increased funding for church planting, 10 years of huge increase in conversation, promotion, and everything. If we are not able to keep up with what we were told we needed to do to match the pace of growth in the population around us, are we doomed to lose? Are we doomed to be overwhelmed by lostness? Or is there something else we need to do, some adjustments that we need to make in order to keep pace with the world as it is around us? And that to me is a very critical question, because right now, with the numbers we were told we needed to have to keep pace with the population, we're losing. Every year we get further behind. And the number of churches per population unit, we're 1,000 or more behind where we were 10 years ago. So I think church planting is critical. I think we have to have more churches than we have. But is the current strategy the best strategy? Do we need to tweak it? And you look at the Methodists and the circuit rider preachers. I guarantee you, there was not a 5-star circuit rider Methodist preacher when they went out to the frontier and they rode their horses from town to town and started little churches and won the West through those circuit rider preachers. They didn't take time to educate them, didn't have time. They needed to get them out there. They just gave them a Bible and a horse and a circuit, and off they went. And Southern Baptist in their past, I don't know of a major American church family that built its success on culling out everybody but the 5-star candidates. Might work for Alabama in their football program. I'm not so sure that's what drives the growth of churches. That's what drove the New Testament growth of churches. We have a few people in the New Testament who played a rather significant role that not many would describe as 5-star candidates. So again, these are just things we need to look at, but in all cases, remember, this is not a conversation about good and evil.
Right.
This is not a conversation about who loves Jesus more. This is not about that. We need to have conversations about outcomes. Are we getting the outcomes we expect? If we're not, don't get mad at people. Ask, what can we tweak? What can we change? What else do we need to do in order to improve and get closer to the outcomes we expect? That's the conversation Southern Baptists need to have.
Yeah, no question. Well, and one of the things I've often said is a 5-star candidate in that rural setting is not going to be the 5-star candidate in the urban setting.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
reality is, a guy is going to look very different who is planting. I mean, I remember in Michigan, we had one fellow that was starting a biker church. He's tatted up, got piercings and leather jacket. And I guarantee you, he didn't look like the guy who's down here at First Baptist, and probably would not have assessed that way either. He had struggled with language and a lot of other things. But when he went to the local biker bar and set up a Bible study in the back room and sat there and opened up his Bible, he was able to plant a church because
Connected, yeah.
There was a connection and they understood. So look, we want to wrap it up, but I want to wrap up on kind of a high note here, if we can, with some positive things. Can you help us by saying, what must pastors and church members in Southern Baptist churches do now? Now that we see this data, now that we hear this, now when people read this book, what is our next step?
Keep your eye on the prize. And that's reaching the lost people in our communities first, and everywhere else second. Keep your eye on the prize. Remember what's first, the lost in your community. What's second, everybody else. And that if you're not baptizing people, then you're not really working on the Great Commission. Focus on that. We got to get that baptismal rate up from 3.2 baptisms per church. We've got to do better than that. Secondly, we need to disciple our people to live distinctive lives. I grew up in the golden age of Baptists when everything was exploding, and people told jokes about Baptists because we live so differently than our neighbors. I haven't heard a Baptist joke in a long time because we blend in now, and we live pretty much the way our neighbors live, and they don't notice us as being that different than they are. We have to live distinctively. Every evangelism strategy from the first century to today is based on the premise that a Christian lives a distinctly different life. We've got to help our people learn to live distinctively. Number 3, teach your people to share their testimony. That is the single most effective evangelism tool that you will ever have. You need to teach your people to share at least 2 testimonies. Number 1, how did you come to know Christ? How did Jesus change your life? Number 2, in what life circumstance did you face a challenge or a crisis and Jesus really made a difference? I yearn for the day when I go to a Baptist funeral and family members are giving their little testimony or tribute to the one who's passed, and they start off by saying, the one thing everybody who knew my dad knew about my dad is he loved Jesus. I went to a funeral where that happened a couple of months ago, and it was such a blessing because each one of the children talked about how much their father loved Jesus. They talked about his imperfections. They talked about how he got mad and got disconnected from the church for a while, but came back. But they all talked about how much he loved Jesus. We've got to teach our people to tell their story. And I think if we can do those 3 things, that's at least a pretty good start. That's pretty doable for just about everybody.
No question. So as a convention of churches, Southern Baptist Convention of Churches, where does the SBC go from now? We're coming up on an annual meeting before long. What do we do? Where do we go?
We have to be very clear. We are in the grip of decline, and we've got to break that grip. That this is an all hands on deck. It's going to take all of us. It's not going to happen in a year. It's not going to happen with this tool or that moment. This is going to take sustained effort. We've got to break out of this vice of decline, and we have got to make this our agenda to get the gospel to the world and reproduce ourselves, because right now we are not reproducing ourselves in the culture. And I would say we need to begin banging clearly again the drum for evangelism. The term Great Commission has been used in so many different ways, so many different contexts. It's lost a lot of its meaning. Let's get right to it. It's evangelism. Jesus told us how to evaluate how we're doing on the Great Commission: baptizing and teaching. And we've got to really focus on helping our churches gear up for that. Number three, we've got to insist on cooperative relationships. I mean, we need to have cooperative relationships between NAMB and all the state conventions. We have got to get back to that decentralized regional agenda where you have a combination of things going on in every state convention. You have the regional agenda, priorities, and you have the national, and you put them together and you come up with a good, healthy blend. And we did that for decades. I mean, we did that for decades. We've got to find a way to cooperate together and not focus on centralized control. I don't think that's very Baptist. Those to me are the things that matter most. And we've got to start looking for outcomes. Just look at what happens. So tell us, give us every year a report. We want to hear the happy news, love happy news, thrive on happy news. Give us every bit of happy news you've got. But let's also give us the realistic news and show us, are we making progress towards the things we set out to do? And talk about that. And then again, to remember, let's not look for heroes and villains. Let's not look for somebody to blame or somebody to beat up. Let's not look for what's wrong. Let's say, okay, what do we do now? How can we tweak? How can we change? How can we adjust? And let's ask our trustees for all the entities, keep up with the big picture of your entity. Look at those stats. Look at what's projected. Look at how far you are down the road. Look back 10 years and see where you are. And you don't have to share information with the whole SBC that needs to be internal information. That's up to the trustees administration. But boy, the trustees need to sure know their institution. And I would, it's hard for me to believe that all the NAMB trustees think Southern Baptists should not know how many church planting missionaries have been appointed. I don't know why in the world, but I contacted two
state conventions. I mean, I've been told by other state convention executives, they don't even know how many church planters are receiving any kind of funding in their state convention.
Yeah. That's the lack of communication that's happened. They don't even know. NAMB doesn't even tell them what they are doing in their state. So we've just got to really work on the communication. Now, here's the good news. We're not in a fight against evil. We're in a fight against lostness. Let's remember that's the big fight. Are there other things out there that we need to address? Yes, but keep them in their place. And let's get our focus on reducing the population of hell, increasing the population of heaven. I don't make those choices. God is the sovereign Lord. We all know that, but we need to do that. The last thing I would say is the importance of logistics. Just understand all that unglamorous stuff. Logistics is absolutely crucial to give logistical support, the underneath support to our pastors, to our churches, to our state conventions. That matters. You are not being a hero when you cut logistics out of your budget and people are not able to function efficiently. And we have stopped supporting our churches, our associations, and our pastors in the underneath things that connect us, that go to where things are broken and repair it and all of that, and provide resources when they're needed. We've got to really pay attention to the logistics undergirding our churches and pastors.
Yeah, I can't agree any more fully than that as well. Well, let me say this as we wrap up. I do encourage all of our viewers to make sure and get this book, The Best Intentions book. We are scrolling there at the bottom real quick for you right now, the website where you can go to here very shortly as well. So I want to encourage you to do that. Dr. Kelley's done a great job pulling this together and trying to analyze some of it to give us some direction and help us to learn some lessons, as Southern Baptists, individually, but also cooperatively as well. And Dr. Kelley, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and to be able to shed some light on this work that you've already done. I know there's a lot more there, but why don't you wrap up for us? What would be the final thing you would want to say to our viewers today?
On my shirt, it says, I'm an optimistic pessimist. And that's what you have to remember. God has not broken out in a sweat over Southern Baptist. Our God is mighty to save, and he can turn everything around very quickly. Choose hope. Choose confidence in our gospel and in our God. And just know, in his grip, the best is yet to come.
Well, with that, we'll close today. I hope you'll join us next time as we continue to interview Southern Baptists and others who are a part of what we're doing as Southern Baptists. Thank you so much for being a part of today's broadcast. Make sure and get this book, Best Intentions by Dr. Chuck Kelley. We'll see you next.